Well, good morning, everybody, and you're very welcome to this IFS event where we're going to be, as the title here says, looking ahead to the spring statement. I'm going to be introducing my colleagues who will be doing the speaking about this over the next 45 minutes or so. Then we'll have 45 minutes for questions. The Slido app you should have access to. Please put your questions in there, vote them up, the ones that you think are most interesting, because they're the ones I will see first. The way we're going to do this is we're going to start with my colleague Isabel Stockton, who will talk about the public finances. Then Carl Emerson will talk about public spending, and Tom Waters will talk about what's happening to households. Now, of course, this is all in the context of yet another economic crisis. I think it would not be unreasonable to call it. They seem to be coming along more and more frequently, don't they? As we've had financial crisis, Brexit, COVID, and now what's happening at the moment. And this is going to be a really, I think, in some ways, an even more difficult set of decisions for the Chancellor to take. He really had very little choice about what he did through COVID. I mean, he could have gone a little bit more or a little bit less, but throwing hundreds of billions at the economy when we shut it down, really, there was no choice. This time round, he has to really decide to what extent the state can step in to protect household living standards in the face of what now looks like it might not just be a temporary increase in energy prices, but a permanent one, or at least a long-lasting one. What is the role of the state? How does the Chancellor see that role? And how does he respond in particular to the much higher rates of inflation that we're now expecting by comparison with what he thought back in October when he set his spending review and other plans? Remember, back in October, he explicitly said that he wasn't expecting this statement in a couple of weeks to be anything other than an update of the forecast. He did not want this to be a significant fiscal event. But whether he does nothing or a great deal, this will be a significant event because it will tell us a lot about his view of the politics and the economics of facing these changes and these difficulties. I will stop there. We'll move straight on to Isabel, who will hand over to Carl Emerson, who will hand over to Tom Waters. And as I say, at the end of that, then do put lots of questions in. We've got lots of time for questions and answers. Use that Slido app. I will now disappear and Isabel will take over.
Thank you very much, Paul. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the backdrop for this spring statement in terms of the outlook for the public finances and how it has changed since the Chancellor last stood up back in October. So just to recap, where were we back then? We already knew that public spending was set to settle at a higher share of national income post-pandemic than it had been before. But nevertheless, thanks to some healthy economic bounce back and substantial tax rises, the Chancellor had delivered his target of a forecast current budget surplus 3 years out. In the process, taxes were set to reach their highest share of national income since the post-war period. And if we compare Mr. Sunak to his 6 predecessors in this graph and look at the permanent tax changes that each of them implemented over their term in office, then we can see that Mr. Sunak implemented as big of a tax increase in just 2 years as Mr. Brown had done in all of 10 years. Borrowing at that time was set to fall sharply, and in fact, in cash terms, was set to go below the pre-pandemic forecast in the later few years of that forecast period. And the Chancellor also reached his secondary fiscal target by having debt fall, if only very modestly, again in the 3rd year of the forecast. Now, what have we learned since then about borrowing in this current financial year? So the OBR forecasted to be at 183 billion back in October. Since then, we've seen government revenues come in stronger than expected over the first 10 months of the financial year. If we assume that that continues in what remains of the financial year in February and March, then we might expect an additional 6 billion of revenues to come in. At the same time, we've also seen higher spending in that part of the financial year. Some of that was higher spending on public services. We would not generally expect that to continue, as departments are very unlikely to overspend their budgets over the whole of the financial year. But an important part of the story on spending is much higher debt interest than had been forecast back in October. And we're pretty certain that that will continue and expected to add another 4 billion to borrowing over the final 2 months of the financial year. So if there are no other changes, we might expect borrowing to come in at around 160 billion. Now, these extra 20 odd billion are certainly nice to have, but what matters more is the outlook going forward in the next few years. And let's start with growth, where the picture really looks pretty gloomy. So if we compare the OBR's October forecast back at the last budget to the Bank of England's forecast only a month later in November, then that was already quite a bit more pessimistic. And the bank further revised their growth forecast downward in the short term in February in its monetary policy report. Now that forecast is from the beginning of February, so it doesn't yet account for the war in Ukraine. Citi has since worked out a new forecast that does account for these events, and that is a further downgrade for next year in real growth. So just to put that into context, these forecasts, while of course still very uncertain what exactly the war in Ukraine is going to mean for growth here in the UK, but it's probably pretty safe to say that growth is not even going to reach the average that we saw in the period between the financial crisis and the pandemic, which is not a period that any of us remember for a particularly stellar growth performance. Of course, the story everyone's talking about is not so much growth, but inflation. And if we cast our minds back a full year, back then the OBR was expecting inflation to be stable at the Bank of England's 2% target. That had already changed in October with a bump of over 4% forecast in that budget forecast. Since then, we've seen a further upward revision in inflation forecast, with the bank expecting inflation to peak at over 7% at the beginning of February. And we already know that the war in Ukraine is going to push inflation upward even further and keep it high for longer. Now, exactly how much further and how much longer is incredibly uncertain at the moment, but two recent forecasts that have been made by NISA and by Citi both suggest that inflation would peak at more than 8%. Now, these kinds of fast increases in inflation are going to impact the public finances in a number of different ways. First of all, tax liabilities depend on cash quantities, and because of that, nominal GDP generally matters more for revenues than real GDP does. Now, that's a general truth, but it's especially true when thresholds are frozen, as several key ones are at the moment. We might also see some policy decisions in response to high inflation. We have seen some and might see some more that could add to borrowing. For example, we might see increases in departmental cash spending plans, and Carl is going to tell you more about those. Or we might see further giveaways to households to help alleviate the squeeze on living standards for them. And you're going to hear more about those from Tom in a minute. Another very direct effect of high inflation on the public finances is through the cost of servicing the government's debt. about a quarter of the government's debt stock is index linked, which means that inflation directly affects the cost of servicing it. And we estimate that higher RPI inflation will increase debt interest by 11 billion in this current financial year. And this effect is set to continue. It's much harder to tell how much it will add to that interest spending next year, but it could easily add up to another 20 billion or more based on current forecasts. As a result, a pattern that we've got used to over the last decade or so of debt interest forecasts continually being revised down and then down again has reversed. Already in October, the OBR was forecasting an uptick in debt interest spending, and we now know that that uptick is turning out sharper than thought back then. Now, we shouldn't lose our sense of context in this. So as a share of national income, the increase over 2021 only reversed the fall in debt interest spending that we saw over the previous year, over 2020. So in historical terms, debt interest is still not very burdensome. But inflation is not the only thing that's pushing it up. So since the October forecast, the expectations for the path of bank rates have moved up quite substantially. And they reached a peak in the middle of February. Since then, we've seen a slight downward revision again, as markets expect the bank to perhaps proceed a little bit more slowly in view of recent events. Nevertheless, if we take these expectations as given, then we might expect that increase to add around 11 billion to debt interest via the direct impact on the cost of servicing those government bonds that are held by the bank through its quantitative easing program. Now, to summarize, borrowing in this current financial year is expected to come in 23 billion below what was forecast at the October budget. And this is in spite of 12 billion more being spent on debt interest, mostly driven by higher inflation. What's more important, in the coming year, we might expect higher inflation to push up debt interest by 20 billion or more. In addition, higher bank rate is expected to push it up by 11 billion through its effect on quantitative easing. We might normally expect a positive revenue raising impact of inflation. However, this is going to be tempered by a very gloomy outlook for real growth that was even before the invasion of Ukraine and has likely got worse, at least in the short term, since then. We've already seen a 9 billion outlay in response to energy price rises as of early February, and we might expect to see more as we move through this crisis, increasing borrowing further. And I will now hand over to Carl, who will tell you more about the impact that all of this will have on public services and public spend.
Thank you, Isabel. So indeed, one potential reason why we might end up borrowing more in the coming year is that the Chancellor might choose to top up plans for spending on public services. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this presentation. So let's start by going back again to October. What was the Chancellor expecting at that point in time? Well, in his spending round, he planned for spending on public services to grow faster than inflation by an average of 3% a year over the next 3 years. Stronger growth in day-to-day spending, 3.3% a year, lower growth in investment spending, but still locking in the big increase in investment spending we've already seen over this Parliament. And what that enabled him to announce is that actually for the vast majority of departments, this really did feel like the end of austerity in the sense that they were not getting further cuts. Their budgets would be growing over the next few years, not necessarily reversing the cuts of the last decade, but growing nevertheless. And actually one exception to that was the Ministry of Defence. That had enjoyed a big budget increase over the last couple of years, but going forwards, it was a department where actually there was a slight cut in its budget over the next 3 years. Now, Those plans were set in cash terms and all predicated on inflation forecasts that, as Isabel's just told you, now look too low. So if you've got a cash budget and inflation turns out higher, you end up with less spending power. Now, how much of a reduction in spending power remains to be seen. When we look at public spending in real terms, we typically deflate it by the GDP deflator. Now, were that to increase by as much as what the CPI did, even pre the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that would wipe out a big chunk of that planned spending growth. So the 3.3% a year real growth in day-to-day spending would be reduced by about a quarter to just 2.4%. And of course, the outlook for inflation has changed since then. That increase in inflation expectations could eat into this even further. So let's dive into this in a bit more detail. Clearly, one driver of the increases in inflation has been increases in the prices of energy and fuel. And the public sector spends a reasonable amount on that. It spends, we reckon, at least £3 billion a year. So if you look in the accounts of schools and hospitals in England, they're spending somewhere between £1.5 billion on energy and gas. And if you look at the Ministry of Defence, they're spending something like £0.6 billion a year on energy and fuel. So we don't know what the price increase faced by the public sector would be, but it doesn't seem unreasonable to expect at least a 50% increase. So that might mean that they'll end up spending about £1.5 billion more in total on energy and fuel. It could well be that the price increase they face will be higher and the sums required even bigger. And actually, if we look at the Ministry of Defence, I've already told you that its budget was planned to be squeezed slightly over the next 3 years. Actually, in the coming year, there was expected to be a very modest real increase. So a £900 million cash increase in its budget, using inflation forecasts as of October, that translated into a 50 million, very, very modest real increase in spending. But that's clearly going to be eliminated by the price rise that they will face on their energy and fuel bill. That 600 million they spend on fuel will become more expensive and wipe out that increase. So if Mr. Sunak doesn't do anything, the defence budget will be squeezed as a result of those price rises. Now, a very large chunk of public spending goes, not surprisingly, on public sector pay. The public sector employs 5.7 million people, and it has a total wage bill of about £240 billion a year. That's about a third of what the government spends on public services. So if in response to higher inflation, we need to spend more on public sector wages, well, every 1% you give will cost about £2.4 billion and will benefit public sector workers in terms of their gross wage increase to the tune of £400 each. Inflation outlook is much greater than what was expected back in October. It's perhaps now going to run about 4 percentage points higher. At the time, inflation over the coming year was expected to be 3.7%. The forecasts from NISA and Citi imply, roughly speaking, a 4% increase in that. So let's suppose the spending round had a view about what the right level of real terms pay for public sector workers was, and you wanted to keep to that, well, you'd have to increase public sector pay by about 4% relative to your previous plan. That's an additional £10 billion. Or alternatively, if you don't increase public sector pay at all, it would be a 4% squeeze on the real wages of public sector workers, totaling about £1,750 each. So what might that mean for individual settlements? Well, we don't know what they're going to be yet. Let's just take a hypothetical scenario. Let's imagine NHS workers get a 5% increase in their salaries in the coming year. That might sound like quite a big increase. It's certainly a lot bigger than they've enjoyed in recent years. It would mean that the spending of the NHS on pay would rise by about 4 billion between this year and next. That would take up a quarter, over a quarter of the increase in the NHS budget, so eating into the money available to deliver improvements elsewhere. And yet it would still imply nurses, doctors and other health workers getting a real wage cut between this year and next year. On the schools budget, if you did go for a 5% award, it would cost something like £1.75 billion, and it would take up almost half of the cash increase in the schools budget between this year and next, and again imply teachers and other employees of the school sector seeing their wages cut in real terms. And there'll be similar challenges in all other public services. Now, decisions on public sector pay are not expected in the spring statement. They're expected later this year, but the Chancellor may well use this as an opportunity to set out his broad pay policy. One thing you have to think about is what's happened to public sector pay in the recent past. In the current year, for most public sector workers, it was frozen. I think given the outlook for inflation, given the spending plans the Chancellor set out, it seems inevitable that there will be a cash increase in salaries. But given how high inflation is likely to be, I think it's highly likely that the awards that public sector workers get will on average be less than the rate of inflation. And that's important because it comes on the back of a quite incredible period. Over the whole of the 2010s, we've seen a squeeze on public sector pay in real terms. So on average, at the end of 2021, public sector workers were paid slightly less in real terms than they were at the start of 2010. That's a remarkable period. And that's not the case in the private sector. The private sector has not enjoyed high pay growth, but there has on average been some pay growth over that period. And we can see the consequences of that in this chart. It shows the average hourly wage, the difference in the average hourly wage of public sector workers compared to the average hourly wage of private sector workers. So on average, public sector workers are paid more per hour than private sector workers. That's not surprising. They have, for example, higher levels of education. They're doing very different jobs. But you can see in this chart how the differential has changed over time. And in fact, at the moment, the differential is already at its lowest that it's been in something like 30 years. And it's much lower, for example, than what it was at the turn of the century, when there were very big concerns about the government's ability to recruit and retain the workers that it wanted. And that squeeze on public sector pay has not been felt evenly across all parts of the public sector. There's been choices made, and experienced teachers have seen a much bigger cut to their real salaries. Hospital consultants seen a bigger cut, and senior civil servants, just to give 3 examples where the cuts have been bigger in terms of salaries. Now, of course, I think it's probably also likely that elsewhere in the economy, private sector workers are not going to be seeing, on average, at least pay awards that keep pace with inflation. And we can see that in the data. Reported settlements over the 3 months to January were running at something like 3%. So it's not like the friends and family of public sector workers will necessarily be getting bigger than inflation pay rises. It's worth noting those settlements that were, though, rising pretty quickly compared to the December figure, and they are the highest level since 2008. So just finally, I want to turn to talk about long-run trends in defence spending. And the big picture here is that over the last 70 years, we've cut the amount we spend on defence as a share of national income really quite sharply. And that's allowed us to increase spending on the NHS without the overall size of the state growing. So the chart here is showing defence spending as a share of GDP right the way back to the mid-1950s. And you can see that as a result of foreign policy decisions, as a result of the end of the Cold War, you can see that defence spending has fallen very dramatically by over 5% of national income over this period. And over the same period, the amount we spend on health has increased very dramatically by about 4% of national income. So those increases in health spending have been able to take place without the size of the state growing because of the cuts we've been able to make in defence spending. Now, I think even 9 months ago, it seemed implausible that further cuts to the defence budget were going to occur. They certainly can't occur on the scale that have occurred over recent decades, hence things like the health and social care levy to help finance ongoing increases in health spending. But recent events clearly raises the question about whether the next move in defence spending might be for it to increase rather than stay where it is. If we look across NATO countries, we can see that the UK is a relatively high spender as a share of its national income, the 3rd highest on this chart. And because of the size of our economy in cash terms, the UK is the 2nd biggest cash spender on defence, much, much smaller than the US, but bigger than other countries. And the UK is one of the very few countries that's been complying with the NATO target of spending 2% of national income on defence. Now, of course, it might be that's one reason why cuts to defence spending are highly unlikely. The UK has taken that 2% target very seriously, but it also raises the question about whether the UK might now choose to spend more. We've seen Germany announce an intention to increase its budget up to 2% of national income. Now, on the one hand, we might think that more German spending on defence reduces the need for the UK to spend more on defence. But on the other hand, if the UK did say, well, actually, we like being the 2nd biggest spender in NATO, that's something we want to continue doing. Well, if Germany did get to 2% of national income, the UK budget would have to increase by about 1/5 to about 1/4 to outspend Germany given that their GDP is bigger than ours. That's something like £8 to £10 billion a year on the defence budget. So to conclude, higher prices is making the cash budgets of spending departments much more challenging. So, for example, the very modest increase in next year's day-to-day Ministry of Defence budget is going to be easily wiped out by higher energy prices. And I, at least, would be really not surprised at all if the Chancellor were to announce a top-up to their MOD budget in the spring statement. There's going to be some incredibly difficult decisions across government about what to do about public sector pay. It's fallen in real terms over the last decade, and another fall in real terms seems likely. Even if we delivered an NHS pay settlement of £5%, that would cost something like £2 billion a year and wipe out a quarter of its planned budget increase, and of course still leave NHS workers facing a real wage cut. In schools, an increase of this magnitude would cost about £1.75 billion. It would take up about half of the planned budget increase, and again, still imply a real wage cut for those employees. The scope for cutting defence spending as a share of GDP in order to cover rising NHS spending, I think, had already ended before recent events. But given the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it raises the question about whether over the medium and longer term, whether the UK might now look to spend more of its resources on defence. I'll now hand over to Tom Waters, who's going to take you through the outlook for households.
Thanks, Carl. Great. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about pay, prices, and policy, and I'm going to be looking at the story so far on these things, where we've got to, and where, most importantly, where it looks like we're going, and what the Chancellor might want to do in response. So, starting off with pay, here I'm showing you nominal earnings growth and CPI inflation up until the end of last year. You can see for nominal earnings that it falls quickly and then spikes. That's just because the figures are quite distorted by the pandemic with furlough and the composition of the labour market changing. So I wouldn't put too much emphasis on those. But what we do importantly see is that at the end of last year, inflation overtook nominal earnings. And the forecast is for that pattern to continue for the next 18 months or so as inflation rises and then takes a little time to come down. If you take the difference between these two things, of course, you get real earnings. And you can see there the forecast is for real earnings to go to decline and not start increasing again until sometime during 2023. Now, what does this mean? Well, the forecast here from Citi is for real earnings to fall by 3.4% over the next 2 years. And just to give you a flavour of how much things have changed over the last month or so, back last month, the Bank of England was expecting only a 1.5% fall before the invasion of Ukraine. Now, that's talking about overall inflation, but inflation, the big spike in inflation that we're expecting to see is not thought to be felt evenly. And that's because the inflationary pressures that we see at the moment are especially, although certainly by no means entirely, concentrated on fuel. And so that hits some households more than others. You can see here I'm ranking households from poorest to richest, and the poorest households allocate nearly 12% of their spending to domestic fuel, whereas the richest households, it's a little over 4%. And so because of that, inflation in the coming couple of months is expected to be much higher for poorer households. You can see there on the left, the poorest households expected to have an inflation rate for the goods and services that they purchase at over 10%, whereas the richest households, it's more like 6.5%. I should emphasize that even 6.5% is very high by recent historical standards. I put the Bank of England target on there of 2% just to make that point. So we are talking about very high inflation across the board, but particularly higher inflation for poorer households. Now, given this backdrop, what has the Chancellor done? What else might he want to do? So back in February, he announced a number of policies. First was a £150 grant to all households in council tax bands A and D. A to D. And he also announced a £200 giveaway to all households recouped in the subsequent 5 years, and an expansion of the warm home discount, which is targeted at poorer households. Now that adds up to a £9 billion outlay this year, which at the time offsets about half of what was then expected to be an £18 billion rise in domestic energy costs. But because of the war in Ukraine, that £18 billion has translated to a pretty eye-watering £43 billion expected rise in costs. If the government still wanted to offset half of that, it would cost another £12.5 billion. Now that's just price increases in energy. Overall, inflation is now expected to be higher than it was back in February. NISA expects to be 1.7 percentage points higher. And given that fact, might the Chancellor want to do more? So one important factor here is that there are various other measures in the pipeline that are shaping households' living standards. So I'm going to briefly just look at those policies that are to be implemented in 2022. The first is an increase in the national living wage coming in April, a 6.6% increase, which looked reasonably high at the time it was announced, now actually won't even keep up with inflation. There's also a 1.25 percentage point increase in national insurance contributions. Income tax thresholds are frozen this year and will be frozen for the next couple of years. That's a tax rise. Fuel and alcohol duties are also frozen. That's a tax cut. And then there are various other freezes as well, things like inheritance tax and capital gains tax. And all of these freezes matter more in a world with high inflation. There are also some reforms that affect businesses, such as changes to business rates relief. So that's what's coming in or will come in 2022. But these changes follow some important changes to universal credit over the past 6 months. The very high profile £20 a week uplift expired at the end of September. It would have cost the government about £6 billion a year to make permanent. But then shortly after that, the government reduced the taper rate. That's the speed at which you lose your universal credit as your earnings increase. They reduced the taper rate, and that costs about half that, about £3 billion. So what's the effect of all of these measures, on inflation, on households' incomes? I'm going to look at these measures highlighted in red here, as well as the energy policies. So again, I'm ranking households from poorest on the left to richest on the right, and starting with the energy measures, you see they have a bigger impact on poorer households. That's because they're roughly flat in cash terms, and so make a bigger proportional impact on the poorest households. You add on top of that the freeze in income tax thresholds. That's a broadly progressive change, taking away on the whole more from richer households. And that's more clearly true when we look at the increase in NICs. The duties freeze is a small giveaway across the board. And so when we add up these things, we find a progressive policy package with households in the top half or so of the income distribution losing on average, and those in the bottom half seeing an increase to their incomes. But as I indicated before, these changes come on top of reform of changes to universal credit over the past 6 months. So to stop showing you too many bars at once, I'm going to combine together all those tax bars into that nice sort of toothpaste color. And then on top of that, I'm going to add on the changes to universal credit. So you can see in the red bars, the reduction of the UC taper, which was a giveaway to households. And then you can see in the blue bars, the expiry of the uplift. And for those households that are in the bottom third or so of the income distribution, the uplift expiry is a bigger deal than the reduction of the taper. And so when we look at the total effect of these policies, incorporating these changes to UC, you can see the black line, the total line changes from that black line to that gray line. And so it's kind of a less clearly progressive policy, still taking away from richer households, but without giving quite as much to poorer households. Now, a number of these changes are changes to temporary policy. The UC uplift was only ever meant to be temporary. The energy measures are only meant to be temporary as well. And so we might wonder, well, what's the effect on the permanent tax and benefit system? And you can see that here. And with the tax changes and the reduction in the UC taper, and the changes are broadly progressive, with giveaways to the bottom half and takeaways from the top half. They're also obviously also just quite a bit smaller. Okay, so let me just summarize what we've seen from those charts. So the first thing is that the reforms implemented this year are clearly progressive. They significantly boost incomes at the bottom of the distribution. And that would be even more true if we included the in-work increases to universal credit, the taper rate cut. But once we go back to September 2021 and incorporate the loss of the £20 uplift, that gives a more mixed picture and makes the reforms less clearly progressive. But much of this is determined by temporary policy. The permanent changes that the government has brought in are both smaller and are more progressive. Okay, so far we've been looking at explicit reforms to government policy, but a really important thing going on in the background is that by default, many taxes and benefits are uprated with inflation in the previous September, which in previous September was 3.1%, and that's much lower than inflation is expected to be over the coming year. Now, where possible, there's a good case for using a more recent measure of inflation, or indeed using forecast inflation, because that reduces the likelihood of this temporary disconnect. But this sort of temporary disconnect is going to matter more for benefits probably than it does for taxes, because those on benefits might struggle for a period of lower income. They might find it difficult to borrow or to draw on savings. Now, back in February, when 2022-23 inflation was expected to be 6.3%, the Chancellor used energy measures instead of changing the uprating rule. Now, for benefit recipients, on average, that was about as good as uprating with expected inflation. But now that inflation is expected to hit almost 8.5%, the majority would be better off with an inflationary uprate. So far, I've talked about changes in real earnings. I've talked about changes in explicit reforms that the government is making. And I've talked about these important changes that come about because of the uprating rule. So let's bring these things all together now for what it all means for households in the coming year. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few example households. I'm going to look at their change in their real net income. So that's taking account of inflation and looking after taxes and benefits, and how that will change in 2022 versus 2021. I'm just going to start with looking at a median earner on £27,500 and someone who's at the 75th percentile of earnings, a bit over £41,000. So real earnings, as I showed you right at the beginning, are expected to fall, so that reduces these households' income. Their tax thresholds are frozen. Not frozen, but are not going up by as much as inflation. That is a moderate drag on their incomes. The government's also made these explicit reforms to income tax and NICs that reduces their incomes further. Then on the other side, we've got the energy measures, which provide a modest offset. And when you add these things up, we're talking about really pretty significant declines in income for these kinds of households. You can see £800 for a median earner and more than £1,200 for someone at the 75th percentile. Now let's do the same thing for someone who is on the national living wage. And the important difference that we see here is that the change in real earnings, while still negative, is quite a bit less. And that's because the minimum wage, the living wage, is going up by more than wider earnings are expected to go up. But nonetheless, someone on the living wage is still also expected to see a decline in their income once you account for all these factors. What about if that person was also on universal credit? Well, you can see the effect of that in these bars here. And the important difference here is that the effect of uprating by less than inflation is really, really pretty significant. And that's because if you're on universal credit, that going up by just 3%, 3.1%, rather than the expected inflation for this year of over 8% is a pretty significant drag on your income. For this example household, the UC uplift, expiry and taper cut also roughly balance out. And so for this household, a living wage worker on universal credit, they see a pretty significant decline in their income. I've just put the numbers on there as well. So you can see the kind of quantities that we're talking about. These are pretty clearly pretty significant declines in income. Now, what I want to do now is just to take those black dots, I'm just going to leave them on there. That's what we expect for inflation over the coming year based on the latest inflation forecast. But what would things look like if we had, what did things look like back in February when inflation was not expected to be quite so high? Well, we see that in the red dots there. And what we see is that over the course of just a month, as the Ukraine invasion has started, the expectations for the change in people's income has got really quite a bit worse, to the order of several £100s. Now, given that fact, the Chancellor might want to make more announcements on top of his February policies. I think it's worth emphasizing that there's a lot of uncertainty around all of these expectations, which clearly makes his job a lot harder. There's a few policies that he might consider. First, he could expand existing energy measures. This is pretty broad-based, but it's quite expensive. It doesn't provide much support per household. And as I said before, if you wanted to cover half the increase in the energy cost, that'd be another 12 or so billion pounds. He could uprate benefits by more. That targets the support towards poorer households. But it's worth remembering that the price rises we're expected to see are significant even for middle or indeed higher income households as well. Uprating benefits by expected inflation rather than the 3.1% that's penciled in will cost something in the order of £9 billion. He could also make a temporary reduction in VAT on fuel. That targets big energy users, but it also distorts people's incentives towards more fuel consumption. I think it's also just worth remembering that these sorts of temporary reductions can be really quite hard to make temporary. If it was temporary and it was just for 1 year, then zero rating domestic fuel will cost about £2.5 billion. So bringing it all together, I think it's fair to say that the year to come looks like it will be a tough one for living standards, with high inflation all over, but especially for poorer households. The energy costs are expecting to see total up to £43 billion, considerably more than is expected even just last month. And the reforms that are coming in this year tend to exacerbate that for richer households whilst cushioning it for poorer households, though that is less clearly true if you include the recent changes to UC. But once you take account of the decline in real earnings and tax thresholds and benefit values going up by less than inflation, it means that we're likely to see income falls across the board. The existing energy measures that the Chancellor has announced only go some way towards compensating that. And the last thought I would leave you with is that I think it's fair to say that there's no easy policy choices here. There are trade-offs between targeting towards those who need the most help, the cost of doing so, and distorting households' energy consumption as well. Thanks very much. I'll pass back now to Paul, I suppose, to take questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tom, Carl, and Isabel. Covered a lot of ground there, and I'm glad to say we've got lots of good questions. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Right at the end of what Tom said, he's described the package the Chancellor announced in February as a modest help to household incomes as a result of the energy price. That was £9 billion. I mean, that was a big package, and yet the scale of what's happening to prices, to inflation, to energy prices is so substantial that actually that 9 billion only goes, as Tom showed, a very small way towards compensating households. We think it's just a kind of an indication really of the scale of the challenge that we as an economy and households and Rishi Sunak as Chancellor are facing over this coming year. I mean, there are lots of ways of illustrating that challenge, but I think that, you know, what in any normal times would be considered a really big package is going such a small way, as it turns out, towards helping with that. So there's two extremely popular questions here on Slido, which I'm going to run together because they're very similar. What might the Chancellor do with national insurance? Could and should he rethink following recent events? From an anonymous questioner, and then one from Heather Self saying, we wouldn't usually expect major tax announcements. Would you expect any this time? Carl, do you want to have a first shot at that?
Sure. I mean, I don't think recent events really change, in my view at least, change the argument about the national insurance rise very much, if at all. I mean, in the long run, the rationale for doing the increase in tax was that there are pressures on the healthcare and the social care budgets. We want to meet those pressures with higher public spending. And I think the government basically deciding it can't do that by cutting elsewhere, and therefore it needed to put up taxes. And I think those pressures and that desire to spend on the NHS and social care hasn't changed. So in the long run, a tax rise of some sort is likely to be needed. Now, there was always a discussion about what the right moment to introduce that tax rise would be, and you could delay it for a year if you wanted. Clearly, one argument against delaying is that a one-year delay may turn out to be a permanent delay, and I've just said that you will need tax rises at some point, I think, to pay for these pressures. And as Tom set out, there will be a strong case for providing support for households to help them with the increase in energy prices, for example, that's occurred in recent weeks. But national insurance is not going to, a national insurance cut or deferring that increase is not going to be well targeted at the households who are feeling the pain most. So I think if the Chancellor's minded to spend temporary money helping households, he'll either do something broad and across the whole population, not just those who pay national insurance, or he'll target it at lower income households who are perhaps feeling the hardest pinch.
You're
Indeed. What about other tax changes? Tom, do you have any views as to whether Chancellor might be thinking about other things on the tax system?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if he was thinking about a zero rating of domestic fuel. There was a lot of chatter about that even back in February. But, as I think, as we said at the time, and as I said in my presentation, it's actually a reasonably small policy, like something like £2.5 billion, and it does have this difficulty of it makes it difficult to undo later on, and it distorts households' choices towards consuming more fuel. I think that would probably be them in terms of tax reforms. The main one I'd be wondering that the Chancellor might be considering.
I mean, I think the challenge for the Chancellor, I think, is very much the one that Carl outlined, which is that the tax rises, if anything, are going to be even more necessary in the medium to long run than he thought a year ago, given that the economy is growing more slowly. There's additional pressure on spending for things like defence in real terms, and that's going to mean that those tax rises need to come in. Now, his big question is how can he defer some of the pain from the what's happening at the moment, particularly energy prices, but inflation more generally. And well, he set out his stall, I think, fairly clearly in February. So what did he do? He gave away money to everyone in council tax band D or below, about 80% of the population, a little bit targeted, and an energy rebate for everybody. So not really targeted at all, but all flat rates, so worth more proportionally to lower income people. So would he cut taxes which are currently progressive so that he gives more away to people on higher incomes? I think he's going to want to try and avoid that. My guess is if he does anything further, it will be some more of the same. In other words, flat rate giveaways, because that helps people on low incomes, and the partly political pressure on him to help people on middle incomes. Going back to what Tom was saying, I'd have thought that the pressure again to actually uprate benefits more than the 3% or so that they're currently rising is surely going to be at the top of his agenda if he really wants to help those who are on the lowest incomes, rather than tax changes. That's not to say that he won't do tax changes, but I certainly don't think that would be the most effective way of spending money. I mean, going down the list, because we've got another couple of particularly popular ones. I don't know, Carl, whether you've got anything to say about local authority budgets and how they're likely to be impacted by inflation. The question is, does this make their funding settlement unsustainable? Well, local authorities actually got, by the standards of local authority increases, a reasonably generous increase over the coming year. And like the rest of the public sector, the real value of that will be significantly eroded by growing inflation. But I think I'd be right in saying it will still be just about positive in real terms. But of course, we know that after more than a decade of cuts, which have reduced per person spending by a good fifth over that period, local authorities have a limited amount of cash. They've obviously also got the very significant additional pressures on them from the social care reforms over the next few years. But did you want to add anything more to that, Carl?
I mean, not really. I mean, I guess I decided to focus on the NHS and schools because they're very high profile public services, particularly in schools. They're also one where a very large proportion of the budget goes on pay, also focusing on defence because of it's being one of the very few departments that isn't seeing its day-to-day budget plan to rise over the next few years as of October. And the simple fact that just the increase in their fuel bill will make it into negative territory if Mr. Sunak doesn't respond. But again, the pressures will be there for all other public services. That's true of local government. It'll be true of prisons. It'll be true of courts. There'll be pressures on public sector pay. There'll be pressures on their energy bills. And right across the board, however generous you thought the Chancellor's settlement was in October, it's now looking quite a bit less generous. And if the Chancellor does choose to respond with top-ups, I guess, where might they go? Defence may well be top of the list. I think I'd be surprised if local government was very high up on the list.
So there's a question I think I'm going to direct now to you, Tom, from Kevin Langford. Last time around, the OBR was expecting the freeze on personal allowances to be worth 14 billion by 26-27. How much will this have increased with the new inflation forecast? Do we have a number on that?
Don't know. More, definitely more. But quite a bit more. Like every percent of changing the personal allowance, which is essentially, inflation goes up by 1% and freezing it is worth 1% more is costs quite well, gets to the government quite a bit of money. So I don't have the figure to hand, but it certainly it'd be talking about quite a bit. And it does, to some extent, I think an important point is that it illustrates the danger with setting nominal freezes over periods of many years, that the size of the giveaway or the takeaway ends up being potentially really quite different to what the government had initially intended. They might have intended a tax cut of, I think when it was announced, something like £7 or £8 billion. It'll end up being a lot bigger than that. Sorry, tax rise. It end up being a lot bigger than that, and that is sort of the problem you face if you set parameters of the tax system or of the benefit system in nominal terms for many years in advance.
Well, I think I'm going to make a promise on your behalf, Tom. I think it'd be great if we could work those numbers out, and we'll tweet them out later, because I think they're really it's a really important question. A couple of questions for you, Isabel, really about the impact of inflation. We've been stressing the downside impact, but does it not have a couple of upside impacts? One, of course, is it erodes the real value of debt, and the other is, as someone has pointed out here, that the GDP level is considerably higher than the OBR expected in nominal terms, if not in real terms, and that presumably will bring in nominally quite a lot more in the way of tax revenue.
Right, so it's very true to point out that in general, higher nominal growth is a good thing for the public finances, because we levy taxes on nominal values, on cash incomes and profits and so forth. And so to the extent that we find ourselves with higher nominal income, that is going to be a good thing. That is also going to be a good thing in terms of the cost of servicing the government's debt, if that debt interest is lower relative to the revenues we have coming in, which we might think of as a measure of the burden that the debt places on the public finances. Now, the trouble is that we are not in a world where inflation is going up and everything else is staying the same. we're in a world where inflation is going up and real growth is going down, at least in the short term. We don't really have a very good idea yet of by how much or for how long, if this is going to be a permanent hit. We've seen some quite wide-ranging estimates of how big the hit might be this year and next year as well. So it'll take time to figure that out. But in the end, it's going to be the combination of these two things, the hit to growth and the hit to inflation, that is going to determine that boost to revenues that we get. So it could turn out not as big of a boost as we might hope through inflation alone. And on, just to add maybe on debt interest, the other thing that might be a positive is an impact on gilt rates. So this again is really uncertain at the moment, but we might expect some impact on just investors' desire for safe assets, and because of that, for government bonds, for gilts to become more popular, and for that to push down the rates on non-index-linked gilts. So I think that might be what one questioner might have been referring to. So it's true that that's a positive. At the moment, that's sort of pretty difficult to quantify, but it might go some way towards counterbalancing the effect of inflation through index-linked bonds.
Thank you. Carl, did you have anything to add to that?
I think just the kind of general point that this is higher inflation that's coming from an external shock. Even if it did mean that the public finances are better off, you've got to remember that that mechanism is probably coming from the fact that, yes, in cash terms, you get a bit more revenue and you're squeezing public service spending by more because you're holding them down to those October plans. So overall, I think it's hard to see that as a good thing. You could always have chosen, if you'd wanted to, have a lower deficit this year to make active choices to squeeze public services rather than one that sort of comes in through the back door. So the mechanism by which inflation improves the public finances is not one necessarily to celebrate. Yes, you get a bit more revenue. The thing that's not adjusting is your cash public service plans, or at least doesn't adjust automatically. And of course, if the Chancellor then has actually to respond with higher spending on public services, then you're potentially back to where you started.
Yeah, indeed, and indeed, it's a measure of us becoming worse off if he does spend less, at least in terms of the quality of our public services. Paul Waugh has asked, does Sunak have even less room now for pre-election tax cuts than that he may have spent his previous headroom on? I think the answer must be yes, for all of the reasons that we've been describing. First of all, I mean, even before the most recent part of the crisis, growth forecasts were down. Secondly, as we've been described, the pressure on additional spending right across the piece is clearly up. So all of that does provide him with less room for manoeuvre, although it's worth saying all in the context in which I think our view has always been that even if he had been able to cut taxes in the run-up to an election, certainly over the period up to the end of this decade, there was very little chance that the tax burden would be less at the end of the decade than currently being planned for. And related, I think, to that, Joel Massey is asking whether he said Sunak raised taxes in 2 years by as much as Brown did in 10. How much of that is due to COVID? Carl, you might want to come in on that, but I think our overall view is not much, and it's certainly not, as people have described it, about paying back the debt that was accumulated over the COVID period, though to the extent that that growth has been hit by COVID and the size of the economy is smaller, there's needed to be more tax to fund public services. But a lot of this, in our view, has been a recognition of the long-term pressures on things like health and social care and indeed public services following a decade of austerity, which has been met by a somewhat more generous spending review and higher taxes to pay for it. But Carl, did you want to add to any of that?
I mean, I think last year's budget, the set of tax rises announced there, the intended at the time cut to personal allowance and higher rate threshold in real terms, the really big increase in corporation tax that's coming. I think it's fair to say that was about fixing the damage done to the ongoing deficit caused by the pandemic. Whereas I think equally, as you just said, that the health and social care levy seems to be nothing to do with the pandemic at all. It's all about a permanent increase in health and social care spending for reasons that were entirely predictable prior to the pandemic. And I think this all means, I mean, Isabel's chart showed that the permanent effect of Mr. Sunak's measures announced to date is a tax rise of £20 billion a year. Maybe that will come down a bit as he's in subsequent budgets. Maybe he will announce some cuts to some taxes, but I would be incredibly surprised if at the end of his time as Chancellor, the direction's changed and that overall he's a net tax cutter. I think that's close to implausible.
And related to that, there's a question here from Ruth Gregory asking, how much headroom do you think Chancellor May in the end have against his 3-year ahead fiscal rule?
Well, his fiscal rules are actually well designed in the sense that they allow you to absorb short-run shocks because they're always looking 3 years out and you never actually get there. So he does have the ability to borrow more money in years 1 and 2 without having any effect on any significant effect on his ability to meet his fiscal targets. Any permanent downgrade to the size of the economy, any permanent increase in spending on debt interest will erode some of that margin of error. And I think it's worth saying that the margin of error he had last October really was very small, both relative to the kinds of margins that previous chancellors have given themselves. In particular, I'm thinking about Gordon Brown and George Osborne, and also really small when you think about the size of uncertainty there is at the moment, when the world is clearly much more uncertain post-pandemic than what it would have been for earlier chancellors when they were thinking about their fiscal targets. So a very small margin of error almost certainly eroded a bit, but actually those fiscal rules gave him a lot of flexibility in the near term because they're well designed.
Well, that's, that I think then answers a few of the other questions about what you expect with regard to the fiscal rules and indeed whether he'd be justified in suspending them. So that's killed a few birds with a single stone. There's a few questions here on pensions, another of Carl's specialist subjects. There's a very general question: how does all this impact on pensions, if any? And a more specific question about the whether this anticipate any change to the pension triple lock, or indeed any change to indexation of pensions this time around. And then a sort of unrelated one, but it mentions pensions, which is about the public, whether your figures, Carl, on public sector pay take account of the more generous public sector pensions. So you've got a couple of minutes to riff on pensions, essentially.
Okay, so thinking about, off the top of my head, I think about private pensions. Most private sector employees are in defined contribution pensions. How they're affected is clearly going to depend on their investment returns. The last few weeks, for example, has not been a good point to be invested in the markets. So it's going to be a drag on those incomes. For those people who are in defined benefit arrangements, clearly higher inflation, those pensions are protected against that. So it's going to be put more pressure on the people providing those pensions, in particular, the very small number of private sector employers who have them, and also the public sector who's got millions of members of defined benefit schemes linked to the CPI. So there's an increased burden on those employers. In terms of state pensions, the triple lock is clearly the mechanism that matters here, where the triple lock becomes expensive exactly in the moments where you have volatility in your economy, exactly when you have inflation outstripping growth in earnings. And this September will almost certainly be another moment when we will see, on average, wages going up by less than inflation. The triple lock, for good reasons, fully protecting pensioners from that in the near term, but for less good reasons, locking in that protection forevermore. So there'll be another ratchet up in the long run generosity of the state pension, unless the triple lock is suspended once again. And it does show that people can have it's very valid to have views on how generous the state pension should be and whether you think the current level is too high or indeed too low. But the mechanism by increasing the state pension that comes from the triple lock is really odd. It basically ratchets it up only in those years when the public finances, when the economy is doing particularly badly, which doesn't seem like the natural moment to decide that you want to be more generous. On the public sector pay figures, I was only comparing the average hourly wage in the public to the private sector. It is clearly true that on average, other parts of the package will differ between public and private sector workers. And one noticeable one is that on average, public sector workers enjoy much more generous pensions than their counterparts in the private sector. So it would shift that graph upwards. In terms of the pattern over time, though, perhaps surprisingly, it doesn't. It would also tilt it because we've been cutting the generosity of public sector pensions over time. We've been, for example, increasing the age at which you can qualify for a full pension. So while they're still much more generous than the private sector, they're not as generous as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. So actually, if you did the pay plus pensions differential, you'd say, yes, the differential was bigger, but you'd say it had fallen by more over the last 30 years.
Getting in the last 10 minutes, there's a broad question here about the impact of the Ukraine conflict on economic growth and inflation. I mean, we are not ourselves making those forecasts, but I should take the opportunity to thank in particular the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, who have shared their detailed workings on inflation and growth with us. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think their view is that inflation will be about 1.5 percentage points higher than it otherwise would have been. But Tom or Carl, you may be more on top of that than I am.
Yeah, their forecast went up by 1.7 percentage points. And yeah, I mean, so if you could be looking at something in the order of 8%. I think so if you look at Citi's forecast, it's over 8% for the coming year.
And the impact on growth, I can't recall what the consensus is as to the impact on growth of what's happened over the last few weeks.
So I think NISA's forecast had a 0.8 hit to growth in the short run, which is at the sort of high end. Citi has a smaller hit, at least relative to the previous bank forecast. As you said, we're not really in the business of making that judgment ourselves, and it's really, really uncertain at the moment how it's going to turn out.
So I think, Isabel, your sound quality is pretty poor. I think you said a hit of about 0.8% on growth next year. Is that right?
That was the NISA forecast.
NISA forecast, yeah. Okay. So I think clearly a substantial impact upwards on inflation and downwards on growth. And NISA actually have been very quick out of the blocks on that and produced something a week ago, looking specifically at the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on growth. There's a sort of there's an interesting question here. Is there a case for relatively large cash parachute payments in terms of the impact and for consumer confidence, which I suppose is not very far actually from what the Chancellor did in February. I mean, this really was a flat rate. For 80% of the population, it was a flat rate payment of £350, 150 from the council tax and 200 off their energy bills, of which, of course, the energy bill number would be repayable over 5 years. But I think that, in a sense, is the really big question the Chancellor now needs to be asking himself. How much is he going to be cushioning us from this effect through either targeted or across the board payments of that kind, in addition to the 9 billion? And as just to return to where I started, that was a big payment, 9 billion in February. It just now looks small because the scale of the economic change has been so much bigger. He's certainly going to be thinking about doing more than that. But oddly enough, I think it's going to depend to some extent on his view of is this a temporary blip, in which case bailing households out for a year is something he might well be considering, or if this is a hit to our living standards that's going to take several years. I don't think he's going to be in a position to bail us out into the long run. If we're poorer in the long run, I'm afraid we are. In the long run, I'm afraid we are poorer. We are just a couple of minutes from the end now, so I'm going to give my colleagues each a last bite at the bite at the cherry. Is that the right metaphor? So the last set of just going through the last set of the questions here, and there's quite a lot still on public spending and the public and the fiscal rules, but perhaps each of you would like to reflect on the biggest messages coming out from, in your view, the presentations that you've just given. So, Isabel, do you just want to just give us the 30-second summary of the message on the public finances? Then I'll ask Carl to do the same on spending and Tom on households.
Right. So we've seen that even before the war in Ukraine, we've had a huge change over a short period of time in terms of expectations for growth, for interest, for inflation. I'm not sure I would deduce from that this is a case of suspending the fiscal rules. As Carl explained, the fiscal rules already allow for short-term adjustment. Now, it may turn out that this is, in fact, as you said, the start of a new era, and this is a permanent change, or one that will be with us for a long time, but I'm not sure we're there yet. So we'll see what the OBR thinks about the hit to the forecast in year 3, which is when the fiscal rule will bite. But sort of as of today, I shouldn't think that would necessarily have a large impact at that point, or that he would need to make changes to meet that fiscal rule. That said, he will of course be thinking about how to cushion the blow in the short term and how to address those trade-offs that we've been talking about.
Great, Carl.
Yeah, I mean, I think because so much of the outlook is uncertain, as well as the fact we've seen such big changes in such a small amount of time, I think that does point to the Chancellor really just focusing on what does this mean for the next 3 months? What does it just mean for the next year? Any longer term issues can be perhaps parked for a bit until we get a bit more certainty about where things are heading. So it does suggest to me, at least in terms of public services, it's probably not do you give defence more money, but a question of how much money and for what do you give defence in the coming year. For other public services, I think it's very much a question of what's the right level of public pay award to give, and how do you balance the kind of, well, actually public sector workers have had a very tough decade. Another big real cut in their wages will be difficult for them to stomach, against the fact that even getting close to matching what inflation is likely to be would be incredibly expensive and eat up a very large amount of the spending plans, the planned spending increases that Mr. Sunak has set out so far.
And Tom.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it does unfortunately look like it's going to be a very difficult year for households. The Chancellor can choose to do things to adjust that, but he can't fundamentally avoid it. The changes in inflation just mean that the country has become poorer, and the Chancellor can delay some of that pain by doing giveaways this year recouped by taxes in future years. He can shift the burden of who pays for some of it by, away from some households and more towards others. But ultimately, he certainly can't protect everyone forever. And so these choices are about delaying or shifting the burden, which, of course, makes them particularly difficult choices.
Well, on that cheery note, which I think it is worth remembering, actually, I mean, there is a lot of discussion about how we can be protected, and we can be protected in the short run, but if we're poorer in the long run, then we can't all be protected forever. And when things like this happen, I'm afraid we do become poorer, and then the question comes about how we distribute that misery across people and across time. and do what we can to avoid as much as we can. But in the end, it's hard to see how we avoid all of that impact on us. And that's why, once again, Rishi Sunak's only been Chancellor for 2 years. It feels like he's been Chancellor forever, doesn't it? Given the number of times he's had to get up and make announcements, given the crises that he has lived through and that we have all lived through. Once again, he has got a pretty difficult set of choices to make when he stands up in a couple of weeks' time, some of which, when it comes to things like the indexation of benefits, it seems to me there are very strong cases for doing, others of which there are some very difficult trade-offs for him to make. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this webinar, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time chewing over what he actually does announce at the spring statement, assuming that he does make any significant announcements. If he doesn't, then we will chew over the impacts of him not doing anything very significant. So once again, thank you very much to my colleagues for their fantastic work on all of this, and thank you to everyone who has been watching.